Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. Good afternoon. For a lot of you, it's still good morning. And for some of you, it is already good evening. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem and critical facilities and digital infrastructure, regardless of what your company's role is within the data center ecosystem. Maybe you're part of a data center operator, such as a colocation provider, hyperscale operator, edge, modular, or wholesale data center, or perhaps your company does something related to data center technology or data center facilities. Over at DCSMI, we catalog 57 different business models in and around the data center ecosystem. Or perhaps your company does something related to data center construction or real estate or investment. Or perhaps your company provides some kind of outsourced sales and marketing services to companies in data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. So that's at the company or the account level. And then what's your role? What's your job function within the go-to-market team? Perhaps you work in some kind of sales related career. Maybe you're an account executive like an AE or a sales development rep, an SDR or business development rep, BDR. Or maybe you only get involved in post-sales conversations like you're an account manager or a customer success rep. Perhaps you're on the marketing team, or you do something related to product or channel partnerships, or maybe you're the maestro, the orchestra conductor, the executive sponsor, the leader, the one that's responsible for recruiting and getting the right people in the right roles, sitting in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their musical instruments at the right tempo, at the right volume. All of the coordination, all the alignment that's incredibly important for playing a world-class role in this unprecedented period of growth within the data center industry. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. Let us know in the comments what you do in the data center industry. If this is the second time, or you're a frequent flyer, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show, please leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue of topics to address in upcoming episodes of this show. So what is on the agenda for today? What are we going to be tackling this week? First up, we're going to look at how a colocation and cloud services business attracts the right VARs, value-added resellers, and MSPs, managed service providers. How a colocation and cloud solutions business attracts the right VARs and MSPs. Then we'll turn our attention to how a data center energy consultancy can market and sell hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers. After that, we'll talk about how a global colocation and scalable infrastructure provider improves timing to close more sales. That's a really, really good one. Colocation and scalable infrastructure provider improving timing to close more sales. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center efficiency and strategy consultancy can create awareness for AI, artificial intelligence clients, how wholesale data center providers can maintain a healthy sales pipeline. And as we head down the home stretch, we're the final topic in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center performance optimization firm engages prospects and increases sales, how a company specialized in performance optimization can engage prospects and increase sales. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first topic. So the first question is, how does a colocation and cloud solutions business attract the right value-added resellers and managed service providers. How does a colocation and cloud solutions business attract the right VARs and MSPs? That is a fantastic question. I'm thrilled that we're starting with that question this week because it's a very misunderstood topic, and a lot of small companies that are just starting to scale up and thinking about starting their first channel partner program. So to be clear, when we think about go to market at a high level, for a lot of companies that decide that they want to have a channel partner program, you're essentially deciding that you want to have two different go to markets, two different sales and marketing playbooks. One that is for direct selling. This is where you hire your own marketing team members and your own sales team members. You have SDRs, BDRs, AEs, account managers. You have all of those folks on your payroll as full-time employees. That's what's known as a direct sales force, a direct go-to-market playbook. Then there's also an indirect go-to-market playbook that's synonymous with having a channel partner program. Sometimes it used to be known as a reseller program. You don't hear that terminology very much anymore, but channel and partner and ecosystems is a really, really hot emerging area that's incredibly important for a lot of companies in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Why? Why has it become even more important, even though these kinds of partner programs can trace their roots all the way back to the 1980s and 1990s? They've become more in fashion in recent years, not just because of capital efficiency and that shareholders love the idea of shifting a fixed cost to a variable cost. The reason why channel partner ecosystems have become more important than ever is changes in buyer preferences. What does it mean to have changes in buyer preferences? Well, 10 years ago, if we were talking about this topic, you would typically find that for most kinds of purchase decisions in and around the data center industry, your prospects, your future clients would get about halfway through their research and decision-making process, and then they'd be like ready to talk to someone from your sales team. At the time, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, yes, that same Gartner, found that about 56% of a typical buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, evaluating pricing, was happening before sales contact, was happening before vendor contact. So that wasn't too bad, because if you did most things right, you could count on the fact that your sales team still got in there for the final 44% of the sales cycle, the final 44% of the buyer's journey. However, 10 years has changed a lot. What's changed in 10 years? Well, 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring and more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people working from home at the beginning of the 2020s, millions of people continuing to work from home. And we now find that that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. 83% of a typical buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. And wow, is this a massive change from back when it used to be roughly half to now when you're hardly in there for any of the buyer's journey, any of the sales cycle, any of the sales process. If you do everything right, you're in there only for the last 17%. That doesn't give you much of a chance to figure out if this prospect is a good fit, to qualify them, to answer questions, to educate and build trust. If you're only in there the last 17%. And if you're not in there for the last 17%, wow, are you really up against the wall? So the question is, what can we do to get you back in there in the awareness and the consideration stage of the buyer's journey? In those formative stages, in those formative years where you have a chance to shape buyer preferences, where you have a chance to educate and build trust during many of those 28 touch points that come between complete stranger and purchase decision. Well, it just so happens that channel partners, VARs and MSPs and integrators and IT consulting firms happen to be pretty good at getting in there early and often. Your direct sales team, they could be good at it, but they may not be as good at all of these little nooks and crannies, all these little segmented, fragmented marketplaces as your channel partners. So that's the big reason why so many companies of recently, even though channel partner programs have been around for decades, are all of a sudden really, really hot on the idea of it. It's not just about the CFOs and the board saying, thou shalt do more with less capital to be more capital efficient. It's about reaching all of these segments with a marketing and sales playbook that you can effectively reach. And even more importantly, it's about improving, growing your marketing and sales and services footprint without taking on more full-time employees and dealing with all of that ramp-up time. For a lot of companies that provide co-location and cloud services, they need those post-sales, those post-services, the professional services capabilities just as much as they need help with marketing and sales, especially if you don't have footprint in that local, in that regional market. Let's say your company is headquartered in the US and you decide you want to significantly grow your footprint in the European Union or the Middle East or Asia Pacific. And in a couple of years, you might open a subsidiary or branch office in that market. But for the time being, a lot of that initial growing of your presence, initial growing of your co-location and cloud can be done by channel partners. But it is a big cultural shift. It is a big mindset shift for a lot of companies, and some do it better than others. What's super important to recognize right out of the gate is when you hire full-time employees, whether they're marketers, sales, account managers, products, your channel partnerships team, your channel chief, they work for your company 100% of the time, 40, 50, hopefully not much more than 60 hours a week on a regular basis, or you're going to burn them out, be counterproductive. But they're working for you full time. They don't have their attention fragmented 4, 5, 6, 20 different ways. That's very different than most of the channel partners that you're going to recruit and onboard and build these relationships with, where you're competing against multiple other commitments that they have, not only with their clients, but there's a very high likelihood that they already participate in 5, 10, 20 or more different channel partner programs. So not only do you have to earn your way in initially, you have to keep earning your way in to be able to continue educating and building trust with the channel partners so that you can potentially co-market with them and co-sell with them and enable them and get introduced to their client roster. And that is no easy task for a lot of companies that really, really underestimate what it takes to build an army of channel partners. It can take significantly longer, but the cool part is when you do this right and you're playing the long game, you may actually find that unless you have exceptionally high employee retention, some of your channel partners may actually outlast many of your employees. In other words, you could have channel partners that are with you for 10 years or more. The companies that are knocking it out of the park, the IT giants on a global basis, the companies like Microsoft and Cisco, they have channel partners going back to the 1990s, in some cases, even before that, depending on how preliminary these programs were getting off the ground. But there were literally VARs and MSPs and integrators who started up in the client server heyday of Novell NetWare and Microsoft Back Office Server. And some of these founders were brand new companies with people in their 20s. And fast forward 30, 40 years later, you find a lot of these owners, founders are nearing retirement age. And just like a lot of things in and around the IT industry, some are facing challenges getting people that want to take over these businesses. It's not a slam dunk that it's a sexy enough business model that all of their sons and daughters are dying to jump into the succession plans. That's a whole separate issue. But for companies that are involved in co-location and cloud, attracting the right VARs and MSPs can have a game-changing impact on your business, but it's not going to happen overnight, even with putting a lot of concerted resources into this. And I think it is a lot of the same go-to-market planning that you would put into growing your client list needs to be put into growing your channel partner list. In other words, in the same way that you have an ideal client profile that concisely describes the geography, the company size, and the industries that you want for your ideal clients, this is on your direct sales force. You also need an indirect go-to-market, your channel partner GTM. Essentially, it's an ideal client profile or an ideal partner profile that describes geographically where these channel partners are going to be located, roughly how big or how small their companies are going to be in terms of number of employees, and any particular industries that are an especially good fit for yours versus not a good fit. Like, in other words, if you are fantastic with your direct clients when it comes to healthcare and manufacturing, well, don't let that be a secret with your channel partners. You probably want to go get VARs and MSPs that specialize in healthcare and manufacturing, whatever vertical you're deeply within. Conversely, if you get almost immediately disqualified on education and government, on the direct side, you also probably don't want to spend a lot of time trying to attract and recruit VARs and MSPs that specialize in those verticals where you just don't have a compelling solution right now. So you need an ideal client profile or an ideal partner profile. From there, you should be able to build out a target account list or a target partner list of VARs and MSPs that fit that criteria. And then from there, you're figuring out at that company size who's the most important and second most important stakeholder that you need to educate and build trust with. That's a really, really important part that a lot of people gloss over. And from there, depending on the size of those VARs or MSPs, it may be an owner, a founder. If it's a much larger MSP, it could be a CTO. It depends. A lot of it depends on how big your company is, how big your target market is, and how big or small those MSPs are. But you need to figure out who are the first and second most important stakeholder at those VARs and MSPs that you need to build a relationship with, and what's going on in their world. Do not assume that the same goals and challenges that show up in your primary and buyer persona with your direct sales team are going to be the same goals and challenges that show up in the primary buyer persona for your indirect go-to-market, for your channel partner go-to-market. So make sure you take the time to have those conversations face-to-face, over video chat, over phone, do the surveys, study their LinkedIn profiles, study their search footprint, and get the consensus in their own words of their biggest goals and challenges that they're having from the standpoint of growing their managed service provider business, of growing their value-added reseller business. And from there, that's your content strategy, that's your website copywriting, that's your event strategy, that's your email marketing, that's your ads. Remember, you have to date and get engaged before they're going to say yes to your proposal. Don't try to elope on the first date. It's a funny Ashton Kutcher movie. It doesn't play out real well when it comes to growing channel partners. So we need to educate and build trust with them and figure out a way to intercept them early and often in their 28 touch points between when they first figure out that there's a goal or a challenge they're trying to achieve in their VAR or MSP business, and when they ultimately decide to sign on for a new channel partner program. And just recognize when they sign on for your program, onboarding just is a new starting line. Because like anything with recurring, it's just another starting line. It's not the finish line. So channel partner enablement is an incredibly important part of getting this right. Having access to the same kind of resources that you would give to your direct hires that are new marketing hires, new sales hires, new services hires, new support hires. All of that needs to be repurposed into something that sets your VARs and MSPs up for success. But at the end of the day, figuring out what is the right fit versus not the right fit, this is all trial and error. Once you get to product market fit and go to market fit and channel partner market fit, you'll have the answers to who is the right VAR and MSP. But before that, everything is an experiment. Once you've gotten to product market fit, go to market fit, channel partner market fit, you'll know all the unit economics. You'll know your lifetime value. You'll know your cost of acquisition. You'll know your average sales cycle length. You'll know your margins. But until that, it's all an experiment. And one of the best things you can do to educate and build trust is treat these as experiments and use email marketing, use events. You just want to motivate those channel partners, those VARs and MSPs, to want to spend a lot of time with your client-facing team members. The more time they spend with you, the more they're learning from you, the more that if your 1.0 version isn't quite right, they'll say, hey, look, Josh, we love what you're doing. This sounds like a great program, but there's this one little thing that you're missing to be competitive. You're not going to get that if you don't earn their trust. So education, trust building, the same way you would do this with your primary and secondary buyer personas and your ICP over on the direct side. You need a version of this for your VARs and MSPs. And then once they're signed on, You need a version of account management, a version of customer success that enables and supports and co-markets and co-sells along with your VARs and MSPs. So that's how I would approach how a co-location and cloud solutions business can attract the right VARs and MSPs. Okay, what do we got up? What is our next question? By the way, if you're getting good value so far from this week's data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you want to be notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So next question is, how does a data center energy consultancy market and sell hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers? How does a data center energy consultancy market and sell hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers? That is a terrific question. And there's a source of confusion that I want to clarify right out of the gate. So data center energy is in a different part of the ecosystem than data center hardware and data center networking and data center cabling and connectivity. When we think about how the data center ecosystem is organized, you have the operators, the co-location and hyperscale are probably the most well-known kinds of operators, sometimes known as providers. Then you have the technology companies, hardware, software, networking, telecommunications, cable and connectivity, IT asset disposition. Those are all largely considered a significant part of data center technology. Data center facilities is an entity, just a part of the ecosystem just in and of itself. We count about a dozen different data center facilities related companies. Cooling and power are considered two of the probably best known in that space, but energy is a really important part of that as well, because we now live in a world where there just isn't enough energy, there isn't enough utility power to go around with all of the aspirations around artificial intelligence and high performance computing and electric vehicles and IoT and smart cities. So energy is having a moment now that's incredibly important, is figuring out how all of this growth is going to continue to happen when so many government entities and regulators, elected officials, community activists are pushing back quite hard and saying enough. There's not going to be any power left for homeowners. There's not going to be any water left for homeowners. What do we do all about that? So energy, especially alternative energy, is a really big area right now. What's important to keep in mind is a company that sells data center technology or is a data center operator, when they talk about hybrid, a lot of times they're talking about a hybrid cloud. What that means is some of your assets live in public or private cloud, and some of your assets live in a conventional data center, like a co-location kind of arrangement, or maybe even you own your own data centers. That's on the technology side, on the operator side, when it comes to digital infrastructure. When you hear the word hybrid, when it comes to energy, that usually means two or more different sources of energy. So there's utility grid energy. There could be hydrogen fuel cells, often abbreviated by the acronym FC or HFC, hydrogen fuel cells. There's natural gas, often abbreviated by the acronym LNG for liquid natural gas. There is nuclear power, SMRs, small modular reactors. And it's, as it implies, it's a small version of a nuclear reactor. And then there is the even most sustainable categories of solar and wind and hydro, right? And then there's a few others things that come up around like geo, right? Like volcanoes erupting and things like that, but that's not going to be widespread in most regions of the world where there's data centers. So what does hybrid typically mean? Hybrid means that you have a company that's decided that for whatever reason, they can't get a utility grid hookup for several years, longer than the life cycle that it would take to build the data center. And this is now an increasingly common occurrence in many regions of the world, especially like Northern California and Northern Virginia. So you see as these companies, especially around hydrogen fuel cells and especially around liquid natural gas, that are proposing that these alternative sources be used as primary, and a secondary could potentially be grid, or if grid is not available, what has been the historical backup power source for years, diesel generators, right? Like massive diesel generators, and using battery power, battery storage, as well as conventional UPS units as your switchover in between going from source to source. So when an energy consultancy is talking about marketing and selling hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers, they're talking about marketing and selling more than one source. So when I think about who the most likely buyers are for these AI data centers that are going to have the willingness and the ability and the interest to be thinking about more than one energy source, combining potentially hydrogen fuel cells with liquid natural gas, with diesel backup generators, with utility grid supply, and maybe even some things like solar or wind or hydro for secondary things like lighting the parking lot or interior lighting or something like that. When I think about all of that and who the most likely buyer personas are, your mileage may vary, but you're trying to get to people as early on in the life cycle of a data center development project as possible. So data center developers, data center site selection experts, architects, designers, general contractors, real estate investors, anyone that's involved in the early planning stages of, hey, we have land, we think we can put a data center there, but we're not quite sure how we're going to get a cost-effective, time-effective way to energize the property. So again, depending on the nature of where you're located, what kinds of energy sources that you consult on, how big or small your clients are, you may have different ideal clients, you may have different buyer personas, but at a high level, those are usually the handful of different kinds of companies that you'd want to educate and build trust with as early on in the life cycle of that data center as possible. Some people in this space also are making a concerted effort at getting to those other stakeholders in the community of wanting to talk about what they can do with hybrid energy infrastructure in front of elected officials, government regulators, executives at utility companies, and even community activists. So there's a lot of potential stakeholders, a lot of different buyer personas to potentially segment out your go-to-market strategy, your thought leadership, your content marketing, and everything that you're trying to do and educate and build trust. Remember, like a community activist is going to care about very different issues than a data center real estate broker or an architect or a data center investor or something like that. So it really is super important to understand your business model, understand who matters most historically and for the kinds of projects you're working on right now, and take the time to do that customer insight research, build and document that buyer persona so that you understand the handful of the biggest goals and the handful of biggest challenges that that kind of individual has when it comes to things that are related to their role in a new data center being constructed, in a new data center being commissioned. And in theory, the commissioning companies could be a source of referrals for what comes earlier in the pipeline, what comes earlier in the life cycle, but more than likely you're reaching people significantly before a commissioning company has been hired. There's these hybrid companies too that bring together multiple parts of this as well. But at the end of the day, your target audience, your ideal clients, how you segment this will be a big function of where you're located, the energy sources that you tend to work with, how big or small their companies are, and historically, which has been the most important and second most important category of stakeholder for you to build these relationships with. It's possible that your company is big enough that you're able to simultaneously educate and build trust with 5 or more different segments. But for most companies that approach us at the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute that are relatively new to this kind of initiative, having more than 2 or 3 different segments that they're simultaneously marketing to, selling to, educating, and building trust with It's just not realistic. And even with 2 or 3 segments, I'm still going to tell you that you need to pick your favorite child. You need to prioritize and understand which is the most important, which is the second most important, and which is important, but not as important as those other 2 segments. But at the end of the day, not only do we need to know about which of these categories of stakeholders matter most, we need to know what each cares about in their own words. And when we're able to capture these insights in their own words, then we're in a great position to do website copywriting. Heck, for each of these segments, they deserve some real estate on your homepage. They each deserve a separate website page. They each deserve some place on your website navigation, your top and bottom website navigation. You'll almost certainly want to have different lead generation offers that educate and build trust with these different segments. You'll likely also want to have educational events for at least your primary and secondary stakeholder, potentially in person, virtually, lunch and learns, breakfast seminars, tours, symposiums, things like that in person, at your facility ideally, or a roadshow or some combination of the 2. If it's not practical for everyone you want to reach to be able to get to your location within a 30 or 60-minute drive, you're probably also going to have a webinar program. With all of this, always record these educational events, because for every person that's in the room, there's probably at least 10 or 100 people that should have been there that weren't aware of or weren't able to attend. Just individually within companies, when you think about a target account list or account-based marketing or the decision committee, there's almost certainly going to be coworkers, bosses, other team members from each company that attends that have other people that should have been in the room. So of course record, of course repurpose. But at the end of the day, your goal as a data center energy consultancy is to get in front of the right people in the right places at the right time. Getting in early and often is incredibly important. Having a role in all 28 of those touch points, or as many of those 28 touch points as possible, is incredibly important. But most importantly, your ideal clients and your prioritized buyer personas need to recognize that you have some of the smartest people on the planet on your client-facing team when it comes to anything and everything having to do with energy consulting and hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers. The better job you do at impressing upon those folks that they want to spend a significant amount of their learning and development, their professional development time, learning from your experts, the better off everything else works. The better you're able to indoctrinate, the better the way you're able to show them your methodologies for how you navigate the life cycle of a project, the more likely it is that they're going to be open to when you say, hey, we know this project takes a village. There's typically people involved from finance and compliance and ESG and construction. So with that in mind, who else should attend this event? Who else should be watching this webinar? Who else should be consuming this? Who else should download this resource? And the great part is they're not formally endorsing your company. They're just spreading this great educational resource. So it's far more likely that you look down at your lead conversion notifications, your CRM, wherever you're tracking this, and you're like, wow, this is really cool. 5, 6, 7 people from the exact same company just signed up, just registered. They're talking about us. Awesome. And you have your first domino start to fall with getting multiple stakeholders from the same company aligned around the same priorities. So for a data center energy consultancy that wants to market and sell hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers, I would lean very heavily into the reality that people are more sales allergic than ever. You need to instead show up looking a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader. And your most important buyer personas need to have very strong recognition that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with energy consulting, hybrid energy infrastructure for AI data centers. So that's how I would approach your go-to-market playbook for how a data center energy consultancy can market and sell hybrid infrastructure for AI data centers. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word. And if you have an idea for a question, a topic, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you watch. So what do we have up for our next question? How does a global colocation and scalable infrastructure provider improve its timing to close more sales? How does a global colocation and scalable infrastructure provider improve its timing to close more sales? Okay, do you want the good news or the less good news first? Maybe we'll start with the less good news and then we'll move on to the good news. The less good news is many of your prospects, many of your clients that you want to have leasing space in your colocation facility are already married to someone else. They're already on a multi-year lease with another colocation operator. Does that mean that that lease is unbreakable and there's a 100% chance that they're not leaving before the end of that term? No, it doesn't. It just makes it a lot less likely that they're leaving before the end of the term. If that colocation operator has a change in reliability, in compliance, a natural disaster that caught them off guard, a massive hit to their reputation, legal issues, a host of issues can cause someone to prematurely look for the exits. However, don't count on that happening very often. So when you come across who you think is your ideal client, a perfect kind of prospect, future client that you'd love to have leasing space in your data center, but they're in month 13 of a 24-month agreement or something like that, note that in your CRM, have a plan to stay in front of them, but recognize that you actually, with month 13 into month 24 isn't too bad. You know, they're out of their lease in 11 months. And if you look at your typical sales cycle length of colocation, yeah, for sure, you want to stay in front of them. That's where your education and trust building on an ongoing basis becomes super important. And being able to have a lot of support air cover to make sure that you're not just nagging them, but are continuing to impress upon them just how smart your team members are about being able to help them with anything and everything related to their digital infrastructure decisions that they're going to make going forward. So yeah, you need to keep track of that. Recognize that it's low probability that they're going to leave early, but it's not zero probability. So the most important thing is to be, when you're in the colocation business, and this is different than hyperscale. With hyperscale, there's such huge numbers that people are willing to invest a lot of resources in staying in front of these huge accounts. But for colocation, they're usually smaller deals. And it depends on how many racks, how many cabinets, how much space they're taking in your center, whether you're selling to small, medium-sized business, mid-market, or enterprise. In some cases, colocation can be so inexpensive at the SMB level that it goes up against, if they're just taking one or two U in a rack, it goes up against like the high end of dedicated server hosting and bare metal and things like that. So it's really, really important that you're crystal clear about your ideal client profile, where you've done well historically. Like, if we look at your case studies page, your testimonials, your reviews, your logos, if we talk about your happiest, most profitable clients in your CRM, what do they have in common? What does that ideal client profile contain? Where are they located? How big or how small their companies are? What industries do they tend to be located in? What industries do you almost never win in? That's important to know as well, so you don't waste resources on long shots that are completely unqualified. But to improve timing to close sales, I think it's very important to recognize that colocation can have a really, really long sales cycle if they're at the relatively early stages of being in someone else's facility. So what's really important is that you use a lot of one-to-many resources. Your best friend in this particular case is not only going to be having a tight ICP, ideal client profile, and having well-defined buyer personas and a great educational resource, educational event kind of strategy, but from a tactical perspective, using email marketing and events to stay in front of the right people over an extended period of time and continuing to grow your footprints in those accounts. In other words, you may initially have a conversion, have a conversation with one person in that account, but you recognize, there's going to be multiple people on that decision committee. So over time, you want to continue to use your downloadable educational premium resources and your educational events to grow the number of people in that company that are aware of your company, aware of your co-location and scalable infrastructure products and services, and perhaps most importantly of all, aware of the terrific world-class educational events and resources that you publish, promote, and host to elevate their profession, to make it even easier for that kind of IT professional in that kind of company, of that company size and that kind of industry, to level up on best practices to help them do their job better, to help their team excel, to help their company excel when it comes to anything and everything having to do with colo and scalable infrastructure. And what this looks like in practice for a lot of co-location operators is a combination of your own events. The great part with like lunch and learns and breakfast seminars and your own events that you host in your conference room or in your classroom, they cost next to nothing compared to going to massive conferences. Like if you have a good email marketing program, a good database of the right people, and they're located in a 30 or 60-minute drive, and you're looking at 12 times a year, inviting a couple hundred people in, first come, first serve for who registers for one of those 20 seats in your conference room or classroom. What does it cost to have those 20 people in for like breakfast or lunch? What are you buying, bagels and coffee or pizza or light catering or something like that? It's almost, this is expense account kind of stuff. And relative to getting a budget for doing these things at a massive global or national conference, or even locally, having to go into a hotel and buying $8 cups of coffee for everyone, if you have your own facility that can host educational events, reserve that place. And like clockwork, once a month, at the minimum 4 times a year, but ideally once a month, have these small targeted events that are micro focused on the biggest goals and challenges of your prioritized buyer personas. And what you will find over time is the more they're learning from your team members, the more the next time around they're bringing their coworkers, they're bringing their boss back with them. And wow, is that amazing when you start to have multiple people from the same company coming to learn from your CISO, your cybersecurity expert, about cybersecurity best practices for mid-market manufacturing IT teams. And of course, bundle in 20 or 30 minutes of breakfast and networking when they arrive. Have fantastic world-class educational content that's so good that if they flew across the country or flew across the planet and spent thousands of dollars or more to attend that conference, you'd be highly confident that that 45-minute session would be the best or one of the best at the conference because they're learning so much. And of course, bundle in after that educational session that there's some informal Q&A and that you take all the attendees on a tour around your facility. Wow, lather, rinse, repeat. Do this for your ideal target clients, your prioritized buyer personas. And if you have a playbook for banks and financial services, and you have another playbook for telecommunications companies and another playbook for manufacturing companies, 3 different series, because then you can very tightly personalize the content, personalize the title of the event, personalize the headline. And wow, does that tend to grab people by the virtual shirt collar as they're scrolling by and deciding like, is this relevant? Is this hyper? Like the more hyper relevant it is, the harder it is to ignore what you're doing. And the more it demonstrates that you have unique differentiation throughout the full buyer's journey. So many people that work for colo and scalable infrastructure companies are delusional about their differentiation. In other words, they think they're totally differentiated, but the reality is they're only differentiated for that last stage of the journey, for the decision stage of the journey, the final 17% of the journey. During the first 83%, they look like everyone else. Your goal, my goal with you watching today's resource, with you learning the answer to this question, is to recognize that you need to differentiate throughout the full buyer's journey. It's not enough to just differentiate at the end. The ones who are able to get in early and often are the ones that are shaping the criteria that your prospects and clients use to evaluate all the other alternatives. And you'll know this is working exceptionally well is because by the time your decision committee gets to the point that they're ready for a sales conversation, they are literally quoting your methodology as the gospel that they've used for evaluating all of the other alternatives in front of them. So not only with this approach are you nearly guaranteed to get on and stay on the short list, but when you do this exceptionally well, your educational events, your educational resources will, for all intents and purposes, be knocking your competitors off of the short list. In other words, there are situations where you do this so well, and it's so ridiculously obvious to the decision committee that your company is the only company to go to for colo and scalable infrastructure, that by the time they're at that 83% point in the journey, whether they tell you or not, the short list may be down to one company, your company. They may not have negotiating advantages if they actually tell you that, but it can become painfully clear after a while that because they're spending so much time in a professional development and a learning development, workforce redevelopment context with multiple team members from their decision committee, from their company, learning from your experts, that by the time they're ready to buy, you've basically won. There's no more price sensitivity. There's no more haggling. They just know that you have the best people on the planet when it comes to co-location, when it comes to scalable infrastructure. So if you want to improve timing, there's no such magic thing as improving timing. Yeah, it's good that you have enough trust established, that you have a date in your CRM for when their contract ends. And it's good that you have an idea that probably a minimum of 6 months before the expiration, the other company is trying to get a renewal. So you want to be in there even earlier. But the most important thing is it's not just enough to get in there early. You need to be in there often. And the best way to be in there often, to build know, like, and trust and a strong emotional bond where they let down their guard, because by default, we know IT professionals are not big fans of marketers and salespeople, right? So we need to get your prospects and clients to, instead of seeing you as transaction focused and seeing you by your traditional job titles, they need to see you as experts, as consultants, as trusted advisors. That's the game-changing unlock to improve timing to close more sales. So that's how a global colocation and scalable infrastructure provider can improve their timing to close more sales. So that brings us to the halfway point on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We'll take a real quick break, and then we'll come back with 3 more exciting topics about data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and we're thrilled to have you joining us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest questions facing people throughout data centers, critical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, critical facilities, regardless of what your role is on the go-to-market team. So next question up that we'll be tackling this week is, how does a data center efficiency and strategy consultancy create awareness for AI clients? So let's break this down section by section. How does a company that specializes in efficiency and strategy consulting create awareness for AI clients? That is a really, really timely topic to be addressing in today's data center ecosystem. Why? Because efficiency, PUE, is really, really top of mind in many, many contexts. And it will continue to be even more top of mind in the coming months and in the coming years. A lot of this has started in the European Union, where there are now directives around sustainability and efficiency and better managing this. Actually, on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, I've hosted some super fascinating interviews with experts on data center energy efficiency within data center facilities that are talking about unique issues about how to approach this and why what's happening in Europe is going to inevitably spread throughout the globe, because so many of these data center operators are global. So once they standardize the reporting in Europe, especially in the European Union, this is going to have to cascade throughout the Americas and Asia Pacific. And there's just in general a movement with recognizing that PUE served its purpose 15, 20 years ago, and there's a next level to better understand what's going on. Some of these experts that I'd recommend looking up is, for example, John Summers from Rise in Sweden, Babak Falsafi from SDEA, the Swiss Data Center Efficiency Association, Mark Acton, a prominent data center facilities expert in the UK, as well as a number of data center operators that are doing some really, really cool stuff around data center sustainability and heat reuse that have also appeared on the podcast. Like, for example, Cecilia Yersel from T-Loop in Sweden, Svante Horn from Scandinavian Data Centers in Sweden, Mark Bjornskort from Deep Green in the UK. There is a lot of innovation going around how to dramatically improve data center efficiency. And most of this is starting within a few pockets of Europe. We have a very, very strong inclination that a lot of this is going to be spreading globally in the really, really near future, just simply because AI and high performance computing aspirations for growth are running up against the ceiling of which utility grid power is available. And there's been so much pushback in so many regions of the world as data center energy consumption approaches or potentially exceeds 10% of the available utility grid power supply. So all of a sudden, people are having to contend with additional stakeholders from regulators, elected officials, utility companies, and community activists. And getting smarter around efficiency is part of solving all of this. So your company is a consulting firm specializing in efficiency and strategy consulting, and you want to create awareness for AI clients. The best way to create this awareness from a marketing and sales perspective for educating and building trust with content marketing and thought leadership is to get really specific about who these AI clients actually are. Because right now, as I was just alluding to, there's very different viewpoints and very different top of mind terminology that drives conversations around data center efficiency and specifically energy efficiency and strategy consulting, depending on the region of the world that you're in. So just like any normal go-to-market playbook, I'd start with defining your ideal client profile. Where are these clients located? Do you truly have a big enough team that you're able to do this energy efficiency and strategy consulting globally, or are you focusing on one region of the world right now? So that's the first thing to figure out in your ideal client profile. Second, are you going to be equally successful at all company sizes? In other words, does the client need to be a certain level to afford your consultancy minimum? And is there a certain point where the client is so large that just your consulting capabilities are just not compatible with the enterprise needs that they would have because they're a Fortune 500 company or a Fortune 50 company or something like that? So get specific on that range of how big that ideal client is and the upper end of the range at which you're going to be successful versus hitting a brick wall relative to your current services capabilities and your ability to successfully market, sell, and service that consulting client. And then the third thing is, are there certain industries that are better fit than others because of more pressure around efficiency and power consumption? So with that in mind, I think that'll help you get a lot more focus on where you actually want to create awareness in the regions. Obviously, there's localization issues that can come up. But even more important, it's not just the localization, it's the kind of stakeholders in each of these target accounts, as well as what these stakeholders care most about. For example, if you talk to a data center developer in the UK or in Sweden right now, they're going to talk a lot more. They're going to talk a lot about heat reuse. It's a really, really big area right now for anyone that's focused on improving the efficiency, the energy utilization of the data center. If you talk to someone that's doing data center development in the US, heat reuse is not a thing in the US right now, not by a long shot. So they're concerned about utility grid power. They're concerned potentially about where they're going to get alternatives that are going to bridge that gap. They're curious about fuel cells. They're curious about natural gas. So there's different issues that are coming up way beyond just the normal targeting issues and localization by language. There's different bullet points that show up in the goals and challenges of the buyer personas in these different regions. So get really clear on where you're providing this consulting of this energy efficiency and strategy, and who the primary and the secondary stakeholders are that show up on these committees, what each of them care most about, their biggest goals and challenges in their own words, And then that's how you go about trying to create awareness the right way. You take those insights in their own words, and that fuels your website copywriting, that fuels your product marketing, that fuels how you design what words you put on your homepage, what goes in your website navigation, how you do your lead generation offers, your premium content, what you decide to talk about and promote at your educational events and your webinars, what you talk about when you go to conferences, what you put in your email newsletters, what goes in your ads, what goes in your social posts. Again, prioritize based on who the most important economic stakeholder is, who that second most important economic stakeholder is, and what is top of mind for each of those categories. Use their words, not what you think the words are, but what their words actually are, because you've taken the time to actually do the homework. So at the end of the day, your goal is to show up early and often, so you stay with them throughout that full life cycle, during the awareness and the consideration and ultimately decision stage for when they decide who they're going to hire for data center efficiency, data center strategy consulting. We need to get in there early. We need to understand what is the goal, what is the challenge. That's a leading indicator in that journey map that they're going to be the perfect prospect for your consulting in the near future, or perhaps even a few months out. Email marketing can be your best friend with educational resources. Event marketing, hosting your own events in your own facility, if that's not practical or cost effective because of how geographically dispersed they are. Webinars, both on demand and live, can be a great way to educate and build trust and create awareness with multiple stakeholders from that same company. And that's a key unlock with this as well. When we talk about these companies, we know at the absolute minimum, there's probably 2 different kinds of stakeholders, but you may have several different people on that decision committee. And the more stakeholders from that company that are coming to your educational events and learning from your client-facing team members about all of the issues that are top of mind for them when it comes to data center efficiency and strategy consulting, the easier it is to frame their whole research and decision-making process around your methodologies, around your best practices. So by the time they're ready to buy, you're not only certain to be on the short list, you may be the only company left on the short list, and they're walking around quoting your methodology because you've used this kind of educational thought leadership approach, trusted advisor kind of approach, to win them over early and often when they were still open to your ways of thinking. By default, a lot of companies that are putting 100% of their resources in the decision stage, that all they talk about is how wonderful their company is, and that's conveyed through booths and sponsorships at events, and there's no opportunity to educate and build trust with these folks. What ends up happening is you don't have any differentiation in the early and the middle stages of the journey. And because you don't have any differentiation, you're leaving the door open for your competitors to walk right in and own that mind share, own that conversation, when it's early enough to dramatically impact how multiple stakeholders in the companies look at your category and ultimately make decisions on what's important and less important with who they decide to hire when it comes to energy and strategy consulting. So my advice, get really clear about who they are at the company level, who they are at the individual level, what they care most about, and make it your mission going forward to get in there early and get in there often. 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. The better job you have of playing a role, of being a factor in as many of those 28 touch points as possible, the more things tend to line up perfectly with attracting, accelerating, closing the ideal clients. And most of all, they're already bought in. So they're wonderful to onboard. They're totally cooperative. There's all the right people are at the table and they trust you. That's most important of all, is to create an environment where you're using learning and development, professional development, educational events to educate and build trust. So that's how a data center efficiency and strategy consultancy can create awareness for AI clients. Okay, what do we have up next? What's our next question? The way, if you're enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. How does a wholesale data center provider maintain a healthy sales pipeline? How does a wholesale data center provider maintain a healthy sales pipeline? So, healthy, just like good or best, can vary by context. A relatively small single location wholesale data center provider, wholesale data center operator can maintain a healthy pipeline for that single location without a massive financial investment. If you have multiple locations, if you have several locations, then you're going to need bigger investments to maintain a healthy sales pipeline. At the end of the day, it's super important to recognize that the challenge of maintaining a healthy sales pipeline today is very differently than it was as recently as 10 years ago. Why? Buyer behaviors have changed, especially among skeptical, cynical IT professionals, IT decision makers. What's changed? They don't want to meet you until they're almost ready to buy. That's the biggest change. So, how do we adjust to that reality? Well, we need to recognize that there's a fine line between a hyperscale client and a wholesale data center client. And some of it is semantics, some of it is positioning, some of it is your size, their client size. But at the end of the day, the one thing that both of those contexts have in common is they are huge deals financially, huge sales opportunities. Very, very different than retail colocation. Retail colocation can be all over the place as well. Retail colocation, you could have clients that are spending not much more with you on retail colocation than they would on dedicated server hosting or bare metal or something like that. That's the self-service stuff that you almost can't afford to have a sales team on anymore. It needs to basically be sold like e-commerce. There's also companies that sell 4-figure and 5-figure a month colocation deals because they're selling multiple racks, multiple cabinets. It's highly specialized. There's a whole bunch of context that can cause the deal size, the sales opportunity to grow quite a bit on colocation. When it comes to wholesale, when it comes to hyperscale, there are no small deals. They're all big deals. It's just a matter of how big. So with that in mind, you're going to have a smaller target account list, a fewer number of companies. In some cases, it could be as few as 10 or 20 companies. Usually it's a little bit more than that. But before we talk about sales pipeline, we need to get really clear on what's qualified and what's not. The way we do that is we make sure that we pull out our ideal client profile and we make sure it's totally up to date for the reality of where you can win, both initially and on an ongoing basis. And in order to do that, you look at your historical patterns, you look at your case studies, you look at your logos, you look at your CRM. And if this is a brand new business, chances are you're hiring someone that has sold wholesale data center space, sold hyperscale deals to similar size companies in the past. So even if you're totally new to this, you need to have a projected ideal client profile of geographically where these clients are going to tend to be located, how big or small their companies are going to be, and are there certain industries where you're primed to win, where you have an unfair advantage, and are there certain industries where you're going to get knocked out because there's something that a wholesale data center buyer or a hyperscale buyer would look for that you just simply don't have, at least today. So that ideal client profile, that'll drive how you build your target account list, a concrete list of usually a few dozen in this context. It could be a few hundred. It's probably somewhere in the middle, depending on how small of a commitment they can make for wholesale data center space versus how big of a commitment, whether you're doing build to suit or something like that. So a target defined list, and then within these accounts, who's the most important and who's the second most important stakeholder that you want to build relationships with, that you need to educate and build trust with. as the earliest stages of getting someone primed to be in your sales pipeline. What's so important now is if your company doesn't have a Fortune 500 kind of brand to lean on. In other words, like if you're coming at this from the standpoint of having a strong blue chip real estate brand as part of your team, like in other words, you work for CBRE or JLL or something like that, then you don't have to work quite as hard because you're leaning on your employer's brand. If you're a much smaller wholesale data center operator that's doing your own sales, doing your own representation, doing your own marketing, doing everything, then you don't have that kind of brand to lean on. You're not working, if you're not working for Digital Realty or Equinix or some other huge brand that you can lean on. So what we need to recognize is from a much smaller company, branding is very different today than it was as recently as 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you could count on the fact that most of your buyers would get about halfway through their research and decision-making process, and then they'd be open to taking a meeting with you. Now, with 10 years of transformation, new generations having vastly different purchase preferences, tens of millions of people getting a lot more digitally transformed as they work from home and all these hybrid working arrangements, we now live in a world where nearly all of the research and decision-making process happens without you being in the room. It used to be 10 years ago, you could count on having a presence for about for the final 44% of the sales cycle, the final 44% of their decision journey. In other words, they get 56% of the way through and they'd be like, okay, I took it far enough. Now I'll meet with an account executive or someone, a representative in this kind of context. Now we're to the point where 83% of that research and decision-making happens before they're open to taking a meeting with you. In other words, even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there the last 17%. This is a huge change, and it's a really big challenge for a lot of companies with an outdated playbook, but it's also a really big opportunity for those that are able to get in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, or as early as possible, and most of all in the right context. In other words, they can't see you as a broker anymore that's just focused on the transaction. They need to see you as a teacher, as a consultant, as an expert, as a trusted advisor, maybe even as a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with wholesale data center space, and specifically their job function in a certain kind of company, in a certain kind of geographic region, in a certain kind of market or set of markets for roughly a certain kind of company size for an industry that's similar to theirs. And the more they see that you have this highly specialized expertise, which by the way, doesn't necessarily need to be you individually. It could be a colleague, a coworker on your team where you show up together and you're like the tour guide or the concierge of these expert resources. But most of all, you're showing up in this context where collectively your client-facing team members are impressing upon the prospects, the future clients, that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to wholesale data centers for a company just like theirs. That's what motivates those folks to want to spend time with you in a professional development, in a learning and development context. And this, if I had to pick all of the areas of the data center ecosystem, real estate has been the most resistant to this. Now, the big brands for a couple of years now have been putting out fantastic weekly newsletters and research reports and doing some webinars and things like that. But there's a very, very sharp drop off after that with leaning into content marketing and webinars and YouTube and podcasting and all of the research reports, all of these things that have been mainstays of how IT professionals research and make their purchase decisions for well over 10 years, including in this ecosystem. Like the big data center operators like QTS, Flexential, Vantage, DataBank, Digital, Equinix, they've been running playbooks like this fantastically for over a decade. Most of the companies in the technology segment of data centers have also been running a great playbook like this for well over a decade. Facilities companies, same deal. Vertiv, Schneider, Legrand, they all have been doing a fantastic job. Eaton, they all have been doing a fantastic job with this for well over a decade. For some reason, real estate developers think that they have something that's so unique, that's cynical, hyper skeptical. IT buyers and investors are going to say, oh, you're a real estate broker. We're going to buy the same way we did in the 1980s and 1990s. What's your fax number? I'm not saying this because I want this to come across from a place of positivity. The big opportunity here is to understand the biggest goals and challenges of your potential buyers and show up in a way that you're seen as a trusted advisor, that you're seen as a subject matter expert, that you're seen as a consultant, as a teacher, which means that if your job title is the same job title that you've had for 10 or 20 years, it may be time to repackage and reposition yourself to have a more client empathetic job title sitting in your email signature, on your business card, and on your LinkedIn profile. For sure, in most cases, it's time to look at your LinkedIn header graphic, your LinkedIn headline, your LinkedIn About Us, and make sure that it's crystal clear who you help, how you help, and the value that someone is going to get by hanging out with you. Because your boss probably really enjoys the fact that you've been to the President's Club a lot of times, but for an IT buyer, a real estate investor, a developer, a general contractor, whoever the stakeholders are that you're interacting with, what's in it for me, dude? I don't care about any of those trophies. I care about how you can help me. The better job you can do with conveying that, the more you're going to earn your way early and often in the right context. In the right context is the huge unlock with all of this. They have to see you as an expert. If they don't, you're sunk before you even started. That's why it's incredibly important to get in early and differentiate yourself and your expertise throughout the full journey. So they're motivated to want to spend time with you. So they're motivated when you're having these great educational events, these great educational webinars, these symposiums, these lunch and learns. They're motivated to want to bring their peers, their coworkers, to bring their boss with them to these events. So you're meeting multiple members from the decision committee before they get to the point that they're ready to make a decision on what they're going to do with wholesale data center commitments. And these are huge, huge deals financially. As long as your company's been established a while, you probably have an idea as to how big these deals are. It's very rare that even in the US that these would be less than six-figure deals. In many cases, they're seven-figure and eight-figure deals. So there's plenty of room to invest in client acquisition. The challenge for a lot of companies is the culture. We've always done it this way. Our clients are different. They don't look things up online. They would never watch a video. They would never come to an educational event. They would never download a research report. All of these nevers. Have you actually done the homework and done the research and asked them how they're learning? Your challenge is not to show up as someone that wants to sell them space and to get them to sign a lease. Your challenge is to show up as the trusted advisor that they turn to for insights and expertise about anything and everything that has to do with picking the right wholesale data center partner. And you're only going to get good at that by getting closer to them, understanding in their own words what their biggest goals are professionally, what their team's goals are, what their company's goals are, what's driving on the flip side, what their biggest challenges are, what's driving them nuts, what's stressing them out to no end, what if they don't figure out could cost them their career. Like, when you know that in their own words, it's a lot easier to make decisions about everything else. So when it comes to how a wholesale data center provider can maintain a healthy sales pipeline, first and foremost, what you're more than likely going to need to start with is figure out how you're going to get cultural alignment in your company around recognizing that the world has changed. It hasn't just changed because of AI and high performance computing and needing more density than anyone was ever thought was possible in the entire history of this ecosystem going back decades and being out of utility. It hasn't just changed because of that. It's changed because as baby boomers have retired and the baby boomers that are left are all digitally transformed. I'm young Gen X, and the people that I know in this space that are baby boomers that are still working full-time, most are probably, if they're still working, are working more in advisory part-time consulting roles. They're all on LinkedIn all day long. They attend webinars. They speak at webinars. They go on other people's podcasts. How do I know that they're on LinkedIn all day long? Because when they're on the podcast and we mention them, minutes later, they're hitting the like button and they're commenting on it. So if you're thinking that your buyers are digitally resistant and they would never use LinkedIn and they would never watch a YouTube video, they would never watch webinars, it already has hit critical mass with even the baby boomers that are still actively in this space. So you really think you're going to have a shot at being competitive with growing a sales pipeline with millennials, let alone Gen Z? If you're still running the same marketing and sales playbook that you have for the past 10 or 20 years, come on, let's get realistic here. The good part is there's a lot of precedent. There's a lot of framework with being able to look at what's worked well with the co-location on hyperscale operators over the past 10, 15 years and the data center technology companies over the last 10 or 15 years. The challenge is recognizing that people can have a lot of fun at your golf tournament. They can really enjoy your cabana party. But does that really educate and build trust with the people that are attending? They're saying that you're fun to hang out with, right? They love socializing with you. They love sharing war stories with you. But at the end of the day, are they walking away transformed? Have you gotten an opportunity to educate and build trust with them? The challenge with all of this is that is the new frontier. That is the new competitive battleground. Either you're going to do this or one of your competitors are. My advice, get in early, get in often, and most of all, get in the right context where your prospects and clients recognize that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to making the right decision around selecting the right wholesale data center provider. That's how a wholesale data center provider can maintain a healthy sales pipeline. That brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've gotten good value from this week's show so far, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you want to make sure that you get notified, that you get invited to upcoming educational events and learn about upcoming educational resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. Final question, what do we got? How does a data center performance optimization firm engage its prospects and increase sales? How does a data center performance optimization firm engage prospects and increase sales? So performance usually means to me that it's something technology related, but it could be something facilities related as well. Usually people that talk about this kind of optimization on the facility side are usually talking more about like efficiency, like PUE, like energy kind of stuff on the facility side. So performance optimization is probably a little bit more specialized on integrating multiple parts of a data center technology stacked together and optimizing throughput bandwidth around that. So the expertise likely is going to be around hardware, software, storage, networks, interconnect, telecommunications, IX, meet me rooms, carrier neutrality is going to be a huge part of figuring out how to optimize the performance of that data center. And again, your mileage may vary depending on the kind of clients that you work with, depending on your team members' expertise, depending on how big or small they are, what they tend to do in-house, how automated they are versus how manual intensive they are, generational divides within your clients about how open they are to automation versus resistant to automation and AI. But so your company focuses, your area of expertise is around performance optimization, and you want to improve how you engage with your prospects and increase sales. I think at the end of the day, it's a pretty straightforward go to market playbook with all of this. The challenge is having the discipline to give it time and give it the proper level of buy-in. And there's a good chance, like with a lot of things with digital go-to-market for a self-driven journey, to find the resources that you need to do this right and to stay with this long enough, you may need to look at your existing investments and stack rank them and figure out what your bottom 20% is. If 80-90% of your sales and marketing budget are going to massively expensive programs and conferences, to find the space to do this well, you may need to identify that, hey, we did 24 events last year. Let's figure out the bottom 10%, the bottom 20%, which are the 2 or 3 or 4 that were terrible, that we got no return on investment from, that aren't our ideal clients, where there's not a good persona match. And there you found your resources to do this well. If you have abundant, endless resources and there's very strong CEO level buy-in for engaging your prospects and increasing sales, you'll have an easier time with this. If your company already has a huge, well-recognized industry brand, you'll have an easier time with this. But in most cases, the kind of middle of the road here is you have some brand recognition, not as much as you'd like. The individuals on your team may not have any professional individually brand, and you need to be building that up to get your prospects and clients to be motivated to spend time with you. But this usually starts from a place of recognizing that this may need to be a big culture change within your company, where your CEO or your chief commercial or chief revenue, someone at that level has said, you know what, we're better than this. We're tired of getting haggled down to nothing. We're tired of getting beat up by our prospects and clients. We're tired of our prospects and clients talking down to us and condescension and ghosting us. And we're better than this. We have some of the smartest people on the planet. It's time to let the world know about that. So going forward, when it comes to data center performance optimization, you are not going to be able to look 5 feet away from you, digitally or in person, without coming across a fantastic educational resource for a specific kind of company and a specific stakeholder in that company that wants to learn about data center performance optimization. But we can't boil the ocean on day one. It's probably not a good idea to try to boil the ocean even on day 365. So what can we do to narrow things down? To narrow things down, let's get really crisp about the account. Let's get really crisp about the company. Where are they located? Can we perform these performance optimization consultancy engagements globally? Or are we really primed with our existing team to do well in a certain region of the world or in a certain country or group of countries? Get that down in your Google Doc, in your ideal client profile. It's incredibly important to start narrowing down geographically where they're located. And language implications, compliance and regulatory implications. We know a lot of these things change quite a bit as you move to different regions of the world. Second, we need to be self-aware enough to recognize that we can't help everybody. And when it comes to your minimum level of engagement, you more than likely have observed that, okay, clients need to be a certain size to afford our minimums. It's not beat around the bush. Maybe you found over time that the client needs to have at least 50 employees or at least 200 employees or 500 employees. Maybe needs to be a large mid-market leaning into enterprise. Only you can answer that question, but just understand that there almost certainly needs to be a floor on the minimum employee size within your ideal client profile for being able to afford your minimums, for being able to be a good fit. At the upper end of the range, there may also be a place where you've observed that once a company gets to a certain size, they're going to do this performance optimization work in-house. They're going to hire a team to run this as opposed to leaning on an external company. And again, it's going to be your experience, you're getting to product market fit and go to market fit and maintaining this over time that's going to give you the definitive answers. But maybe for this particular category, they need to have at least 200 employees and less than 10,000 employees. Because at 10,000 employees, your company size relative to their company size, it doesn't match really well right now. They tend to push you around a lot. They ask for things with financial terms or compliance or legalese, whatever it is. It just becomes too much of a burden to deal with. There's too many locations. It just doesn't fit with where your core competencies, where your sweet spot is right now. So maybe you decide that your ideal client is located in your country or a couple of countries, and they have, say, 200 employees to 10,000 employees or 200 employees to 5,000 employees. Okay, we're getting somewhere, right? We're narrowing things down. And then third, we need to figure out when it comes to performance optimization, are there certain industries that you're especially well suited to help with and not for others? Like, for example, depending on where you're located, there's a lot of regulatory issues. There's a lot of compliance, accreditation, certification issues that come up either across the board or in certain industries. So make a note in that ideal client profile that'll impact your targeting, your drop-down lists, your website navigation, your filtering in your CRMs, what's qualified, what's not qualified. Note industries that are a really good fit and industries that are a really bad fit, because we want to make sure that we capture all that information to work as efficiently as possible with how we engage our prospects and nurture them and educate and build trust with them over time. And that we make sure that most of all, that your client-facing team members are spending time with the right people, because there's no faster way to sabotage your initiative than having a lot of resources going to people that were never a fit out of the gate, or even if they signed on as a client, we're not going to be a successful client. So all of this is reverse engineering what a successful, happy, profitable client looks like, and making sure that that's baked into your deal stages and your sales process, and make sure that it's baked into how you engage with that prospect, with that future client throughout their full journey and the awareness and the consideration stage. And that's the big asterisk. That's the big bold highlight with all of this, is that for a self-driven buyer's journey, especially when we're talking about selling to hyper cynical, hyper skeptical IT professionals, IT decision makers who, let's face it, are not big fans of marketers and salespeople. We need to figure out a way to get in there in a different context where they don't see you by your traditional sales titles. They instead see you as a consultant, as an expert, as a teacher, as a trusted advisor on performance optimization. How do we demonstrate that? All the content marketing and educational events and playbooks that have been around for 10, 15 years at this point. Once we have that ideal client profile, we build the target account list. From the target account list, we figure out who the prioritized buyer personas are. Once we know who the second most important persona is, we get clarity on their biggest goals and challenges in their own words. And then we use those bullet points on the biggest goals and challenges to come up with our content calendar, our website copywriting, our educational events calendar for both in-person events and virtual events, digital events, both live and on demand. And then we use those goals and those challenges to deliver a ton of value early and often, so that the right people in the right companies are highly motivated to want to spend time with members of your client-facing team, and recognizing that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to data center performance optimization. This is what it means to differentiate throughout the full buyer's journey. Most companies that are integrators or consultancies specializing in performance optimization, best case scenario, they're doing some differentiation at the decision stage, at the tail end of the journey, when the game is 83% over. You, in today's self-driven journey, can't sit out for the first 83% of the game. It's kind of like, imagine that you're a general manager of a professional sports team, like a football team or a baseball team or something like that. And your best players are sitting on their hands for the first 3.5 quarters out of the 4 quarters of the game, or the first 7 or 8 innings of the baseball game. It'd be ridiculous, right? Why wouldn't you have your best players in there? And there's always edge cases, but for the most part, you want to be in the game. You don't want to forfeit the game by not showing up and conceding this to your competition, because your new competitive battleground is getting in there for the full journey, and recognizing that in a self-driven buyer's journey, the way to get invited in early and often to earn a seat on their side of the table is by repositioning, repackaging, reinventing yourself to come up with a better job title for your email signature, your LinkedIn profile, your business cards, that makes it super. And of course, optimizing your LinkedIn profile, your headline, your about us, your header graphic, to make it super clear that you have deep expertise. Obviously, there's going to be different members of your team that have different levels of deep expertise. Your junior members of your team may look more like tour guides and concierges. Your solutions architect, your engineers, your CTO, they're going to look more like the PhD or the MBA version of the Big Four consultancy. But at the end of the day, yeah, that's what we want to look like. We want to look more like a Big Four consultancy and less like a transaction focused salesperson, a transaction focused AE or marketer or something like that. So at the end of the day, if we're trying to, as a data center performance optimization firm that provides these professional services, engage our prospects and increase sales, we need to recognize that the entire game has changed. We're not just optimizing around utility power constraints, around unprecedented power and cooling challenges that largely stem from AI and high performance computing issues, but will eventually be exacerbated by EV adoption, electric vehicle adoption, and smart cities and more IoT. We need to recognize that our buyers have changed as well. There's been a change of the guard. There's been a generational shifts in how people research and navigate these purchase decisions. And we need to be realistic about showing up in the way that they want us to show up. They don't want to spend time with vendors anymore until they're almost ready to buy, if they spend time with you at all. And the way to get back in there early and often is to be seen by the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So they see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center performance optimization for that particular job function in a company just like that. So that is our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm so glad that you're able to join us for this week. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me an invitation to connect and make sure that you put a message in there that you were watching, that you heard about this on the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic that we should address in an upcoming episode of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you are watching. And we look forward to seeing you back again next time. We wish you great success in growing your company, your team, and your individual role in this amazing period of opportunity and growth in all things related to data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing you back again next time. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.